My big hobby when I was young was I was a ham radio operator, and I built some of my own equipment. I loved doing electronics, and then my grandmother gave me a telescope for my birthday.
The Delhi Public Library, which was near the old railway station, had a fantastic collection of books, and so I used to kind of go on my bicycle over there.
And I walked onto the stage of Carnegie Hall, you know, as a 16-year-old. And when I came home from that experience, I remember a night when I lay in bed and I said, I've got to try to do this.
I remember once going to the library trying to read about how the frontal lobes worked, and I couldn't find much. And I thought, here's a big hunk of the brain, and no one seems to know.
That the expansion of the universe is accelerating poses very fundamental questions about basically the laws of gravity and space-time and Einstein's relativity. What we know now today is that the universe is quite a dynamic place, and it evolves. And the big, most fundamental questions to me involve, you know, how did all of this get started, and where is it all going? How's it all going to end?
All my work has been on the writing of history and how it's done. The question is, in fact, the question of what is the past? How does it get created? How does one shape it? What are the investments, either political or social or emotional or psychological, that lead to its being constructed in the way that it is constructed?
The only thing we have to understand the intentions and the wishes of composers who lived many, many years ago are these texts that they've given us that have these kind of hieroglyphs on them that really have very little relationship to real sound. But we have to interpret them. That's what we do. We interpret texts. We have to figure out what it should sound like, literally, what it should be in sound, but also what does it mean? What is the emotional content of the piece? What is the storyline?
My core strategy course is called Warriors and the Rest of Us. And one of the things I try to do with the students is let's surface some of the uncomfortable questions that we ask ourselves, which are usually questions, well, you know, what would I have done in those circumstances? And I think it's very important to be explicit about that. And it's one of the reasons why I try to get my students reading novels and watching movies and reading poetry.
What we would most like to have happen is sort of the Jurassic Park of Egyptology, you know, that we want to wake up one day and find an ancient Egyptian that we could just ask questions to. You know, I would like to know what happened to Hatshepsut. I mean, she just disappears in the 20th year, and suddenly she's just gone. Did she die? Did somebody murder her? You know, these are silly little things, but they're the kinds of things that we obsess over.
Many of us got into the field because we were interested in very broad problems like, say, consciousness or creativity. And then you realize you couldn't study that. Now, interestingly enough, the pendulum's swinging back the other way, and people are starting to ask the question, what about creativity? How about social interaction? So there are funny fields now. There's a field of neuroeconomics. How do people make decisions about risk and how much risk they want to take? You wouldn't have dreamt of trying to study that a few years ago.
The real focus, you know, of what I've done is how do genes talk to each other? How do you turn genes off and on? And frankly, the real exciting thing about, you know, where this led me was to the sort of the idea that gene therapy doesn't have to be moving a new gene into the cell. Gene therapy can simply be turning off the bad gene and turning on a substitute gene.
What can we learn from living organisms to create better engineering systems? That's the big picture. The specifics on that is two fronts. One is, how can we now apply engineered solutions to trying to solve medical problems such as spinal cord injuries? Or, on the other hand, how can we make robots that are mechanical and man-made, you know, behave in a lot of ways as living organisms?
What constitutes a successful immune response against these lesions? And what constitutes an unsuccessful immune response? Those are both equally important questions. Tumors secrete cytokines and chemokines that prevent the immune response from adequately sensing that it's there or knowing that something dangerous is there. And so now we're starting to understand that. And so I think about that a lot. I think about T cells. I think about how we can change the microenvironment of an early lesion so that the immune responses that we elicit will actually be able to see the lesion and get rid of it.
I think in the background is this desire to understand how we came from this single cell to this very complex organism consisting of well over 200 and some different cell types arranged spatially and into organs and tissues with very different functions. And what is that? What is really at the basis of this? How did this all come about?
We know that actually the immune system has mechanisms for being able to clear viruses out of neurons without hurting them, without getting rid of them. And so we've been working on, and we continue to work on, and I would very much like to understand how that works.
Traditionally in law enforcement, we have treated the symptoms. We have responded to the crimes almost always reactively until the last decade or two. But we still continue to solve the symptoms, make them go away, and we believe everything is fine. What we've learned from the medical folks and the public health folks here at Hopkins is how to treat the symptom and the illness simultaneously. You can't ignore either one. And it's changed the way that we look at law enforcement.
See, I think it's a mistake to think this is violence, this is poverty, this is something else. It's not really what happens in everyday life. It's the way that these things fold into each other, so that where you have a constant ecology of fear. I think equally I'm very interested in thinking about poverty and the kind of questions where we don't name it as violence, but it looks to me like violence.
Socrates begins his career as a philosopher asking the simple question, what is the best way to live? And, engages in a rational discussion of human ends. And so all the public policy questions that we face have to be shaped by some understanding of, what is the, what are human goods and what is the good life that we seek? What does human flourishing mean? And what are the kinds of institutions and political orders that can promote that?
We're asking major questions about how to set up a just world. Not little questions, but huge questions. What do we owe one another across national borders? Is health a commodity like any other that should be left to the forces of the global marketplace, or is health and medicine, are they special? These are not little questions. They engage everything about who we are and how we ought to structure our worlds.